question was.
So the question is, let's go ahead and answer the question perhaps that's been throughout the audience. Is the goal to stay in ketosis all the time, or is it okay and appropriate for us to expect there to be a cycling in and out in different tissues making ketones or not? And in your experience, can you stay in ketosis when there is no calorie restriction?
Thank you. I'm Eric Westman. I gave a talk yesterday at a view in my clinic, taking through 25 patients at various stages of a low-carb ketogenic diet. In 10 years of treating people with a low-carb ketogenic diet, after 10 years of doing research in clinical medicine, studying in great detail 200, 400 people, depending on the dropout rate, in a low-carb ketogenic diet, I haven't seen any of the bad effects that people say will happen. So with the context that we started in 20 years ago is that you would die if you didn't eat carbs. And clearly that's not true. And now we're at the point where if you don't eat carbohydrate and you measure ketones with breath, blood, or urine, we really don't know which is the gold standard. Not everyone achieves a higher level of blood ketones, urine ketones, or breath ketones when they're restricting carbohydrates. It's okay, and we think, and we don't know. We're an emerging science in its infancy, its toddlerhood, and those who want, if I have some, then better, more is better mentality, it may not apply. So I think in your response is perfect, which is, if you don't eat carbohydrates, you're going to be in ketosis as defined by what? There's really no good definition of it, although we're coming up with some parameters. And yeah, you'll be in ketosis sometimes and not. Sometimes of the day there'll be more ketones in the blood, and so yeah, it's a variable system. And I can just chime in that it's not bad for you, at least in any obvious sense. In fact, the research that we saw today about Alzheimer's and cancer and other degenerative diseases of inflammation, it may even be better for you to be in ketosis or on the border of, or just not eating inflammatory foods. But I think at the animal study level, the ketone level might matter. So that's where you hear Tom Seyfried and they have the cancer researchers talking about a certain ketone level. That's not in humans yet. And the biology and systems in these little rodents, very different sized brains, ketone. So Steve Phinney, one of my teachers, if you don't have Phinney and Golik's, the art and science of low carbohydrate living and the art and science of low carbohydrate performance, those are the advanced course of low carb ketogenic diets. The primer would be the New Atkins for a New You that we published in 2010. I'm one of the 3 authors on that.
Fantastic.
So
Can you tell us about your thoughts on what you've seen over those 20 years? Because very few clinics have done the longitudinal look that you have, which is critical data for us. And so, in your experience with somebody who starts off initially 20 years ago trying to do ketosis and not doing well, did they get better over time at getting into ketosis? Were they able to exercise their systems into producing more ketones, or has that not been observed?
Yeah, so that's tough to know. I'm in a clinical practice now.
Yeah.
In all honesty, the research money to study this area is very low. Now that more companies are involved, we're getting more because our federal government said you can't study this. Basically,
Right.
It's called a paradigm shift, where all the people who are giving the money out, and it's a human endeavor, the panels all thought this kind of diet would kill people. So they throw out the grants so people didn't even apply. So we're in an era now where we're getting studies done, and so I really can't comment. I mean, you'll hear people say, I can't get into it as well and all that, or I'm losing weight this time, it's going slower than last time, and I pull up a slide that says, it works slower if you're older. And the last time you tried this, you weren't older. So there are all these kinds of things that people don't remember, but I really liked your comments and talks. The biology is fascinating, but the entire organism, I also have a feeling of safety because of the human history of 490,000 years of not consuming, not being in glucosis, because you're basically burning what you eat, and so that gives some comfort to me. It's not evidence we need today. We need more studies and longitudinal studies, but from a clinical standpoint, I just don't see the big things that people thought would happen.
And certainly not being carbogenic is very important. So I think from the perspective of someone who is very insulin resistant, can I get a witness, anyone? There's a lot of us in this room, at least half of us in this room. I think you find you naturally come in and out of ketosis without trying. Anybody notice that it's very hard to stay in ketosis when you're insulin resistant? And again, if you have light insulin resistance and you're pretty hardcore in your ketosis diet, you're going to be in ketosis most of the time. But I found it's extremely hard. In the morning time, I'll pop at 0.3 sometimes. I'm like, really?
This is perfect. I want to stop right there just because there's a second kind of insulinemic hyperglycemic reaction that happens in the ICU, happens in our type 2 insulin resistant people. They never get type DKA. They get what's HONK. It's what we used to call it. Now they've dropped the O and it's just HNK, but it's hyperosmolar non-ketotic coma. And so hyperosmolar non-ketotic coma is the extreme version of what you just said. Is if you're insulin resistant, no matter how deplete you are in glucose, you cannot get into ketosis. So somebody in hyperosmolar non-ketotic coma, your typical DK will come in with a blood sugar between 400 and 1,000. Pretty amazing blood sugar to get to 1,000, right? Your HONK patients can get to 2,000. They'll be in the 1,200 to 2,000 range in the ICU and they'll be in a coma. And they're hyperosmolar because there's so much sugar in their bloodstream. And their insulin levels are very high because they're very insulin resistant to begin with. And as they get an inflammatory event, i.e. pneumonia or sepsis or cellulitis that turns into sepsis, you name the natus, they get more insulin resistant as the acidity from the immune reaction to whatever they're suffering gets worse. And they suddenly get so insulin resistant that the insulin is just unable to touch that oxaloacetate and get it to take off to ketosis. And so you can have super high blood sugar and make no ketones. And so you can have a blood sugar of 2,000 and have no insulin effect whatsoever, and you're not making ketones. And so that's the mild version of what your experience is. If insulin resistant, insulin's so high that's very unlikely that oxaloacetate is going to turn off. Because if the insulin is high, oxaloacetate is never going to shunt to ketones. It's always going to keep you going through Krebs cycle. It's not until the insulin levels get super low that you're going to start to see ketosis. There's a couple of versions that are mixed of this, of course, because no biology is black and white, right? So you can see a hyperosmolar non-ketotic coma patient who generally is not very acidic. They're more acidic than you and I are because they're sick, but they're not anywhere like a bicarb of 0.5 that you see in DKA. So they're mildly acidic and they're not very acidic because they're not making ketones. And so they're still pumping. And so you have to have no insulin effect inside the mitochondria before oxaloacetate will shunt to ketones. And so the only time this can happen in an insulin-resistant person is if you're so insulin-resistant at the surface of the mitochondria that the receptors are so gone for glucose and for the insulin that even though you might have a level of 30 of your circulating insulin, it's not getting inside the mitochondria because this environment is so screwed up. And so you can see variations of that.
I wonder, for those who are new, this never happens in the outpatient setting in someone who's following a low-carb ketogenic diet. These are people who are sick.
Oh, and these guys didn't get sick because they weren't on a ketogenic diet. If they'd been on a ketogenic diet, they probably never would have gotten sick, right?
Yeah, so in 10 years in clinical practice, the only time I've seen it wasn't DKA, it was actually an SGLT2 inhibitor, these new drugs that make you urinate glucose are not good to combine. In fact, they have a risk of ketoacidosis without being on a ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
But doctors will prescribe these willy-nilly without asking you what you're eating. And so that's the only time I've ever seen someone in ketosis.
Same here, yeah.
And how long were they on the blocker?
Ketoacidosis.
How long were they
I
on
don't know how
SGLT?
long. I don't know how long
Okay.
she was taking it.
2 months.
She was not.
2 months?
She was not in. She was on it, and then decided to do a low carb diet. This is a friend of mine. It wasn't a client. And she started a low carb diet. Didn't tell her doctor. Was never told she needed to tell her doctor. Ended up in the hospital for a week with renal damage.
Yeah, so this is a drug that blocks the ability of the kidney to reabsorb sugar. And so you just start peeing out your sugar. And so now you're dropping sugar through an abnormal pathway that's non-insulin dependent. And so you're peeing out insulin, or peeing out sugar without the role of insulin, and so you have got an abnormally, artificially lower blood sugar level, which is confusing the hell out of the brain. And if you're right, so now if you're in a ketotic state and you take this, now you've lost your ability to get either in, and you're going to go into a very acidotic state very quickly, and you're pulling water with the sugar into the urine, which is the last thing you want to do. The kidney is supposed to preserve glucose, protein, and water beyond everything else. Protein should never leak across the kidney tubule, neither should glucose. Glucose doesn't show up in your urine until your blood sugar is over 180. We call that the renal threshold of glucose metabolism. And so over 180, you're spilling glucose into the urine, but anything under that, not.
Quick question on
So hang on.
Okay.
That's a nice rabbit trail, but I want to finish my story.
Sorry.
Because in the morning it was 0.3, but then later in the day you'll pop a 1.6. And your A1C is 5.1, for example. So you know your blood glucose stays under control. You know you're probably keto adapted, and as part of that keto adaptation, naturally coming in and out of the ketosis, it just happens. And so if that happens to you, it's okay. People freak out, write me all the time. 0.3 this morning, 110 blood sugar, what's going on? I said, test this afternoon and call me in the morning. Because it's going to be better later in the day. So obsessing about one number, one reading at one time is always the wrong thing to do, and I'm very interested in what the rest of the panel here has to say.
Quick question though, can I ask, because you just said the two drugs you just mentioned that basically are used to get glucose out through the kidneys, that was based on a natural supplement. It was apple, a derivative, I can't remember the name, and apparent those particular products weren't that profitable, so they more or less have been phased out from my understanding. But it brings up the question, there's a number of companies in this whole evolving market about keto everything that it is actually coming back into the market doing more or less the same thing you just described. Would you say that there's a big caution to use such a supplement, since there is a caution with the drugs that were developed from that?
I'm not a big supplement guy in the first place. I'm a big real food advocate.
Yeah, no, I get that.
And I remember the doctors that taught me saying, any drug can do anything. And I'm like, oh, come on, that's just, I've become one of those doctors. Any doctor can do anything. And I suspect if there's a side effect, a rash, don't blame the foods first, blame if you can change the diet or a supplement, take away all of those and reboot and see if it goes away. But yeah, I'd have a concern about that's a supplement that makes you urinate out glucose.
Absolutely. It's by one of the companies that makes exogenous ketones. It's just that they're trying to be clever.
Well, so the clinical research should guide us.
Yeah, that's right.
So wait until you see some studies done on it.
Just as I spit up, there's a number of healthcare providers here. So is this an absolute or a partial contraindication to LCHF for these people on SGLT2s?
So is it a contraindication to change the diet because they're on a drug?
Well, no. I guess my point on the West, I would get them. I would get them off the drug.
Exactly.
I would put them on a diet, but
Yes.
it's that case of that person. The word is getting out into the real world, and people are going to come to us on LCHF. So if I have somebody on an SGLT2 who has been resistant to diet, I'm going to have to tell him or her, if you go onto this, you better talk to me
Yes.
before,
So,
because that's a contraindication for him or her.
Stop the medicine, and when they change from 200 carbs to 20 carbs a day, your blood sugar will go down 50 to 100 points, which is more powerful than that medicine anyway. So often we'll take the oral, these are just pills, take those away immediately on the first day.
I mean, I'm fortunate because I practice in Canada, so we're not as litigious, but I could see this as being a real issue in the States where the physician would be blamed for having that person on and not having informed about the
There's
LCHF
lawsuits
risk.
on Invocana. You just have to Google it. and there's
No, but the LCHF specific issue or the other ketogenic diets.
So I don't blame the diet for the drugs issue.
No,
So,
I don't either.
And this is a good point. Even in a litigious society like the U.S., litigious society, it's the drug's fault if someone goes hypo when you change the diet. Now, this is why we have the keto clinics, why we have doctors who, at Obesity Medicine Association, people trained in this, because the drugs can be very dangerous. And it's not the diet's fault, it's the drug's fault. And yes, you might haplessly be the drug doctor who says, yeah, cut the carbs and then do the insulin. But stand your ground. It's the drug that caused the problem. So the human body defends against a low blood sugar. The blood sugar will not go low unless you're on a medication. So, and this, people don't know that, you gotta teach that. But I don't know of any lawsuit against an LCHF doctor in the last 20 years, other than a trumped up one by a diet doctor, and it got thrown out, and it's still on a website saying it's active, because they have a different agenda. So anyway, I don't know of any credible lawsuit, and tell me, email me, and let me know. I've kind of been out there asking for the last 10 years in medical meetings. Haven't heard of one.
The biology behind the second one, and this is super exciting to hear from you because you're going to have a good insight into
Well,
exercise.
here's what I need, Doug.
Yeah.
Can you do me a favor and bring me up a translator? I feel like I just got dropped in China. And here's the thing. So I can relate to a lot of things that Dr. Pompa talked about last night because here's the thing. Coming from the background as a bodybuilder, the thing that we do and the thing we bring to the table is we're willing to experiment to do anything regardless of what it has to do with our health. Like literally, we're willing to compromise everything in order to produce a result, which is why we're constantly changing things up. It's the same thing when you're working out your physical body. You understand that the body adapts very, very quickly. So if it's adapting to your nutritional regimen, it can also adapt to your exercise regimen, which is why for me, I'm always changing things up to try to break the adaptation of the body. So one of the cool things about biohacking and that term and how I've taken and adopted that term is that understanding everyone's different, yet everyone's looking for a cookie cutter application to everything. The question that you're asking, you have to ask the next couple layers of questions is it for a therapeutic application? Because if I had some type of illness and I know that there's a healing power in that type of application in keeping carbs and sugar out of my diet, you better well believe that I'm not going to compromise that. If we're talking about athletic performance or we're talking about, different types of, what are you trying to accomplish is ultimately what we're trying to get at here, because Dr. Pompa makes a lot of sense because there are times that I will break that process. For me, like if I'm traveling and I'm not getting a chance to work out or have any type of exercise really at all, I'm staying much more strict in terms of keeping carbs and sugar out of my body. However, I do experience, and I have through the process of just experimenting so many different ways with my body, understand, and I've taken clients through it too, where he's 100% right in terms of sometimes you just gotta kick them out of that body that's trying to adapt and adjust to what you've been doing. So that's why I've seen all the time individuals that go into this very strict ketogenic diet and they get a lot of great results right away, but then all of a sudden they hit this sticking point. They've been in that sticking point for literally a year, and all I simply suggest is, hey, try just incorporating a little bit of the cleanest source of carbohydrates, low glycemic carbohydrates that you can, and sure enough, they just do it for a couple weeks, and boom, they're over that hump, go right back to where they were, and they're on the path of back to their goal. Now that's weight loss. That's not a therapeutic type of application. So for me, it just depends on what is it that I'm trying to accomplish, because I come at it from a very different stance than these guys. I don't work with the amount of patients. I'm not taking literally hundreds of people through weight loss applications, or some of them having serious issues that go well beyond a cookie cutter application. So that's the biggest thing for me. I believe, and the question is do you believe that you can stay? I researched, the first thing I did when somebody challenges me on, is it bad to stay in a deep state of nutritional ketosis for a prolonged period of time? I say, well, I know Dr. Jeff Volek personally, and that man has been in that state for decades, and he looks phenomenal at his age. He performs phenomenal. His blood work is phenomenal. And if that's an indication, then, hey, sign me up. I'll go as deep. So that I'm never worried, but at the same time, I see seasonal implementation of carbohydrates, or even, any type of carb cycling. Hey, do I think that serves a purpose? I sure do. But it just depends on the purpose. Like, we're all going down the same freeway and we're all going to the same city. We all may be in different vehicles and in different lanes, but we're all headed to the same place, right?
Right.
want to hear from me.
Well, you have, again, longitudinal experience.
I have
So
longitudinal experience.
do you find that patients are able to stay in ketosis better over long periods of time, or does it continue to wax and wane like this for years?
You know, I'll work with somebody like 4 years ago.
Mic up to your mouth.
Okay. Work with, just to give you an example, somebody that I'd worked with 6 years ago, glioblastoma, shouldn't have lasted more than 14 months, even less because she wasn't able to do the standard of care.
Yeah.
She went through radiation, but she couldn't do the recommended chemotherapy, and has done no therapy since, except ketogenic diet. And it's a vegan ketogenic diet. Just recently, in the last few months, she's added fish.
Yeah.
But she's tiny. She doesn't look at food as she doesn't need meal plans or recipes. She just knows what she needs to eat. And that's what she does. She just eats to live, and it's working for her. At some point it may not, but right now it's working for her. And she's living her life. They travel, they go on vacation, she works still. So it's a wonderful thing. And other people that get back to me will say similar things, like, well, I dropped out of it and then I got a bad MRI, so I went back to it, but it's easier for me now. So they get out of it, and then they realize that they really do want to be in ketosis. That doesn't happen for everybody, but the people that are able to maintain it long term are not as obsessed about their numbers. That is a definite thing. They are no longer as obsessed about their numbers because they know it's working. In the beginning with cancer, there's always that doubt, because there's doubt, they're surrounded with doubt. Everybody's telling them this isn't going to work. So, and they're hearing that from their medical community. They may even be hearing it within their family. So they're so sure it isn't going to work that when it does, it kind of blows them away. And then, like I said, they kind of fall out of it, and then they come back to it. And when they come back to it, it's a much simpler, more relaxed. They're not trying to tighten it up anymore and get the glucose and ketones in that tight range. And they're doing great. And usually what I'm seeing is they've developed this simple eating pattern. They're eating, not the same exact foods. They vary it summer to winter. But, they're not creating a new meal every day. It's not important to them. So they've lost that connection to food as comfort. They're looking at food as fuel, and that's where I think people can be really successful. As long as you cling to food as comfort, and I understand where it comes from, especially in cancer, I get it. I walked in those shoes. I had a mom tell me that that she couldn't do this diet, even if it would work for her daughter, because her daughter liked chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream for breakfast. It's like, okay, well, can't you do something similar to this and still, consider the diet? But, and I don't see, people don't have to be calorie restricted after a point. They really don't.
Yeah, that's good.
They're calorie controlled. I draw a distinction, and it's just in my own head that I draw this distinction. Because I've never seen it in writing. Maybe you have, I don't know. But calorie control, that's where I'm at. It's like I don't consciously think about calories, but if I haven't had enough, my body's going to tell me I need more. And if I've had too much, then I'm not going to eat for a while. So I'm listening to my body instead of listening to what my hormones are telling me to do. I'm just listening to something deeper in my body, and that's where people are successful with this. They're successful with cancer. I can't speak for other disease states, but I do know the people that I have worked with Parkinson's, they know that they have figured out that if they are not ketogenic and they're just trying to use a supplement, and like 4 years ago it was just MCT, but now they can use exogenous ketones. They don't get the same bang for the buck. They see the difference, and they are feeling so good that and these are the cognitively intact people, they'll go for it. They'll go to that next level. Even if they don't become ketogenic through diet, they are definitely low-carb people. They've gotten rid of the junk. They're eating whole food. They're really respecting food in a different kind of way. It's that respect for food.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
So good.
Yep.
So beautiful.
I would love to, well, a couple of things. One, a quick thing about your question about cycling in and out of ketogenic diets, just from a personal perspective, and then I want to make sure I also address this concept of comfort food and emotional eating. So, first of all, with that chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream, you're just making your cancer more comfortable. Cancer loves that food. But in any case, I've been on a ketogenic diet myself for most of the past 4 years. And the whole idea of cycling in and out terrifies me because when I fall off the wagon, which I do as a human being from time to time, I could get right back on the next day. I know logically I could do that, but I psychologically can't. It's really hard for me. One day will become 3 days, will become 5 days, will become 3 weeks. And it's just a different state of mind when I'm on the other side of that, fence. I don't know if anybody else here in the room has had that experience, but I find it really much easier to stay in ketosis than to try to go in and out of it. I think it's a nightmare, at least for me personally. So that's what keeps me on the straight and narrow most of the time. But then about emotional eating, so I'm a college psychiatrist, I work at a women's college, there are emotions everywhere. And I hear all the time, in fact, I had a student tell me the other day, Dr. E, I deserve chocolate. So what do you say to that? I mean, that's just...
Eat 100%.
You can hear that's a sentence dripping with addiction, right? That's an addiction. And sugar is incredibly addictive in the brain. So about this emotional eating, at least I found for myself, being a recovered carbohydrate addict for many decades, I used to know what it felt like to eat emotionally. When I'm on a ketogenic diet, I don't have those, I literally don't have those emotional cravings. And I think there are many reasons for this. A powerful one is that insulin and estrogen and neurotransmitters are all talking to each other. They're not separate hormones. So it's a system that's coordinated. So insulin raises estrogen levels. Estrogen raises insulin levels. Estrogen regulates 3 essential neurotransmitters in the brain that are responsible for mood and energy and appetite and sleep regulation and so on and on and on and on. So I've come to understand that emotional eating is really just, it's a false signal coming from your body that's driven by this metabolic mess that's going on inside. It's not normal to need food to feel comfortable. Now, there are some exceptions, people with trauma histories, for example. There are definitely exceptions, and I have long conversations with people to tease that apart. But for most people, I believe that emotional eating is a symptom of hyperinsulinemia.
Couple thoughts there. To show you up so close, and there's a saying in the obesity medicine world: you don't want the holiday. You can take the holiday. You don't want the holiday to become a hollow week and a hollow month, and then Thanksgiving turns into Valentine's Day, and people have gained back everything they lost throughout the year. So at first, in a ketogenic diet for weight loss, you're very, very strict. Teach it very, very strict, and then that will maximize your chances. Emotional eating is fascinating, and it, again, it's just me and a nurse's aide who, he's pretty well coached in how to talk to the carb. Emotional eating fades away, and this is a kind of a more behavioral perspective where, let's say you emotionally eat, but what you're eating isn't giving you the comfort or relief that it used to. So I used to study smoking cessation techniques, and we would give people denicotine cigarettes without nicotine in them, and they would smoke for a few days and then go, this is terrible. Where's the nicotine, right? So you can fool people. So let people eat, and so we teach: eat foods that don't have carbs, and eat when you're hungry, eat when you're emotional, eat when you just don't worry about, I'm an emotional eater, nothing works. Don't just do it. And what happens is that I think the brain learns somehow. Figure out the pathway, please, Zach. The brain learns that you're not getting the same reward from whatever you were doing, and it extinguishes in the term of neurotransmitters the reward, the heightened. The food just doesn't give that response anymore. And so in my experience, the emotional eating component just kind of fades away, and yet I don't have to treat it. I don't need to send people to a behavioralist. It just is kind of automatic.
I agree with that.
Yeah, macaroni and cheese used to be a food group for me. Now it's gross. I mean, I've tried it every once in a while just to go, this used to be in my, and I spit it out, don't I, Christine? Because it's just not the same anymore. And one of the things that helps too with this whole discussion about emotional eating and getting into ketosis, out of ketosis, if you feast So you have the whole week, the whole month, the whole year, and you never get back on. One of the things we wrote in Complete Guide to Fasting was follow those periods of feasting with periods of fasting. That's the way we've always done it throughout human history. So it's very natural, very normal, despite what you hear out there in the media.
I'll tell you, for me, that's the number one reason why I personally started using exogenous ketones, because as a bodybuilder, you know, eating 6 and 7 meals, I told you when I first started off, we're talking 9,000 calories. You don't just go from eating chicken and brown rice and all this crap, which I'm just saying that because who wants to eat quinoa and brown rice 6 and 7 times a day? But the point is you don't just turn that off. Like, you're strict during that period of time, but then when I got around the pizza and trying to turn off this emotional, I was an emotional eater, and when I started studying on, especially when I'm putting sugar in my body, like, I would literally, because I've had drug addicts in my family, and I've seen how they go through withdrawals with drugs, and my behavior, while I would be like, oh, how could you ever be a drug addict? My behavior was almost identical with food. I mean, I was seriously an addictive eater. I would be the one that identified that there's pizza there and I'm not going to have it, and I would avoid it, and then an hour later it's still there and I would avoid it, and then 2 hours later it ain't happening. And I'd have the pizza, and later that night I'd have ice cream, and then I'd have the next thing, and then the next morning, and it was a cycle for me that absolutely psychologically I had a hard time breaking. And I don't know what it is. Like I said, there's a lot of studies we're doing right now, but that, to cut that craving for carbs or sugar, or to feel more satiated, and eventually, like you said, Dr. Westman, you absolutely do adapt and change, because for the longest time in my life, I was known as the guy that could eat more food than anyone. Like, that buffet line 3 years ago, that would have been me like 15 times. Now, I couldn't even finish my first plate of food, and I don't know why that is, and I'm not hungry. It's not continuing that addictive cycle that used to take place. So I don't have those same types of issues, but but it's been 2 years. Like, it wasn't like, hey, the same discipline I applied to eating those 6 to 7 meals, all of a sudden I was able to just turn it on and turn it off. I dealt with the exact same issues. So
We talked about that a lot last night at the 9 to 1 a.m. session.
Wait, no?
And so, what we were talking about was self-love and sensuality and its relationship to our drug-like food behavior. And what we were reflecting on was the neurobiology. And the neurobiology is fascinating as to where memory and emotion occurs. And it's in the temporal lobe of the brain. So you asked me to do this. So you brought it upon yourself. And so the thumb is a very good representation of the hippocampal formation that's in the temporal lobe. And the thumbnail is about the same shape and size and location of the hippocampus. This is where you take short-term memory storage and then shove it into long-term memory in your periphery. We actually hold most of our long-term memory outside of the brain. Wrapped around the fingernail of the hippocampus is a little rim of tissue like your thumb, and that little rim of tissue is the entire neurologic structure that processes intense negative emotion. Fear, rage, lust, hopelessness, abandonment, all of those emotions are occurring through neurotransmitter firing in this tiny little, less than a couple millimeter structure in the temporal lobe that's wrapped around your memory center. And so when we find ourselves emotionally eating, what we're experiencing is a shut down prefrontal cortex. Our frontal lobes, which are our reward system, are shut down because of stress of some sort. And with that shut down state, we're starting to get into these loops of, instead of going forward with the neurologic activity, we're going back into our memory banks and the emotions that we've tied to those memories. And what we find over and over again, especially with women with really chronic or men with very chronic eating disorders, is they can usually tell you exactly which memory is tied to the emotion that makes them eat the carbohydrate. And so when I find myself or one of my patients needing the chocolate ice cream or needing this, or like you said, having no turnoff of satiation, you know their prefrontal cortex is shut down. And the most powerful way to break that cycle is exactly what you're experiencing in your patients who are, without any instruction, moving out of this emotional eating. What they're finding in the process of taking care of their body over a couple of years is self-love. And I really believe that the acceptance of self-love is the most powerful way to turn back on the frontal lobes so that you're not looking to the ice cream or the cookie or whatever it is to stimulate the prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobes. And so all the addictions we have, cigarettes are a great example in schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is defined by functional MRI as the perfect example of a hypofrontal disease. Schizophrenics, you can give them chocolate or sex and they still are not stimulating the prefrontal cortex like the rest of us do. So it takes a very powerful stimulus to get their frontal cortex, and one of the only things that does it is nicotine in very high dose. And so the schizophrenics have always smoked themselves into treatment. They are self-treating their frontal lobes with the cigarettes. And so we can do the same thing with carbohydrates or sugar, all these simplified reward systems up into the frontal lobes. And fat and salt do the same thing. And so if you do a meal at McDonald's with the exact right fat and salt combinations, you get the same prefrontal cortex stimulation. So emotional eating doesn't mean high carb diet necessarily. It doesn't mean just sugar. Some people are much more drawn to the fat salt, which I would actually include myself in. When I'm stressed out and grumpy and pissed at myself and losing self-love, I'll go through 3 bags of potato chips before I ever reach for a cookie. I'm just not drawn to it. And so it just depends on what your brain wants to stimulate that prefrontal cortex.
So now that you're on mechanisms, why would my patient with schizophrenia do better without eating carbs, and then over this last holiday he has auditory, hears voices that are very, very loud, disturbing his interpersonal relationship, and he came in with his mom, and 2 sugar cookies. After 6 weeks of being keto, things were better. 2 sugar cookies, it got worse again, and now he's a little better. It's not by any means gone, but it's a signal, and so thinking along the brain activity.
He was reintroduced to his prefrontal cortex or frontal lobe activation. So his brain prefers over fat salt, will prefer the sugar to get that frontal lobe to turn on.
So he ate specifically the sugar itself. You might think any food.
It turned on all I know is it turned on dopamine.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so whether it was glucose or the insulin and all that, it doesn't matter so much. All we know is his frontal cortex turned on. And my guess is he's been through a lot of treatment, maybe drugs, maybe therapy, whatever, and he's moving away from his schizophrenia and your ketogenic diet's happening.
Go away from schizophrenia, go to the general population. People feel they have more willpower.
Yeah.
They have more frontal lobe.
They have more frontal lobe.
Yeah,
There's no such thing as willpower.
Right.
I was talking to a couple earlier in the weekend. She's like, I am the most loyal wife in the world. I'm like a mother bear and I protect my husband. People can tag me all day long. They tag my husband. I'm the most loyal woman in the world. I'm like, no, you're not at all loyal. You are not a loyal wife. And they've been married for 15 years and never cheated on each other or anything else. She's like, totally stopped her in her tracks. But fortunately, we had developed a little bit of trust over the previous hour before I told her she was an unloyal wife. But when I said, you're an unloyal wife, she had the self-respect to listen for a second and said, you're right. It's totally situational. I'm only loyal to my husband if he's loyal to me, and it's good for our kids to stay together. As soon as that scenario changes, I might not be a loyal wife, and I might say, screw you, I'm going to go protect myself over here and have a life over here. And so, I don't think there's such a thing as self-control, or I have so much self-control. No, none of us do. If our frontal lobe starts to shut down, we have no self-control. That's why we all go and eat the wrong thing.
But how does eating carbs reduce the frontal lobe activity? It seems like a general.
No, it'll turn it on. And so it's like smoking a cigarette. And so simplified sugars will turn on dopamine release and then light up the frontal lobes. Fat salt combinations the right amount will light up the frontal lobes. So it's not so much again that it's a carb or it's a fat or it's a salt. It just needs to turn on dopamine, a reward system, which often will have less, I think, to do with the biology and more to do with the emotions. And so if your recollection is that schizophrenic kid in his teens or something like this remembers one of the most moments of nurture was Christmas time as a child when he was eating cookies and he really felt nurtured, warm, safe, rewarded. And now he's a little bit not feeling that. Frontal cortex is low. The cookie, yes, glucose, but it's also tying into a memory that has an emotion attached to it that's going to load up the frontal cortex.
Question. I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, I'm totally willing for an alternative perspective.
Go ahead, ask.
What's your question?
Okay. I guess I was just asking, I know motor goes into the prefrontal cortex, but is that close enough to fire into the frontal cortex by, like the room next door warming up, can you break that cycle with exercise?
Yes, for sure.
Adjustments.
And this is why people can be
Massage.
addicted to not sugar, but to exercise. And so you probably see this where you say, wow, that person's super fit, but they are not healthy because they've used the exercise as a drug, and they're not accepting themselves, and they're super insecure about themselves. And they might look like the perfect specimen, but if you have a half-hour conversation, they are riddled with self-doubt, their body,
1 million.
1,000,000%.
I'm addicted to breathing. I can't stop doing it.
Yeah!
So actually, you're right. There's an exercise called Keto breathing that helps you to stop breathing. And it extends life, extends
And
longevity.
it only works one time.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can I just want to revert, I'm sorry, back to the metabolism thing quick, because I'd like the input. Because where I got confused was when you said they all enter the Krebs cycle, whether it's glucose or fat, to ATP, to acetyl-CoA. I understand that from a nutrition background. However, then you mentioned that we are better in a lipid metabolism, okay? So I think, in my mind, I'm going, maybe we just need to get away from defining us needing to be in ketosis and more
Yes.
just looking at this as, we're looking at, but then what really threw me a loop was you said that the amount of carbs I eat are not going to dictate whether I'm in a lipid or glycolytic metabolism.
The amount of insulin you have.
The amount of insulin. Okay, so then my mind goes, well, eating a lower carb diet is lowering my insulin. You know, I don't have to be in ketosis, I'm just saying emphasizing healthy fats in my diet will automatically put me in a lower insulin state, which is a higher lipid metabolism, which is, from what I'm understanding, the preferred state and what these people are experiencing, a therapeutic state. Is that correct?
So remember that both glucose and lipid can go to ketone.
I get that part.
So in
but
that
I'm not worried
way,
about the ketone
I
part.
totally agree with the comment that like you said, we are all in the same boat, going the same way, we're going to get the same
Right.
tank.
You're also factoring in protein?
Well, no, all I'm trying to do is get the backdrop of saying, if our goal is to be primarily fat burners, okay?
You won't become a preferential lipid metabolizer just by being on a ketogenic diet. If you're making ketones, it doesn't necessarily make
I'm not
sense.
saying you have to be on technically a ketogenic diet, I'm just saying being on a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet, won't that preferentially make me a fat burner whether or not I'm in ketosis?
It's not what we've seen. I mean, that could be, but only if your insulin levels get low.
But
And
won't
so
my
if you're
insulin
insulin
levels
resistant and
automatically...
eating a ketogenic diet that's high in fat and low in sugar, when you're at rest and not exercising, you're very likely burning glucose into acetyl-CoA into the ketone.
With that, but how do I have high insulin if I'm on a low carb, if carbs are what stimulate insulin?
Like I said, you got to factor in protein too, because
No.
the biggest sticking point for you realize that protein, too
I
much protein
absolutely realize
converts-
that. I understand where you're going with that, but I think it's...
Well, if it was true
I
that
get what you're saying.
If it was
but-
true that glucose or carbohydrates raised blood sugar and therefore raised insulin and made you insulin resistant and therefore was unhealthy and caused cardiovascular disease, if that was true, then all of the vegans who are on super low fat diet, who were a part of Esselstyn's group at Cleveland Clinic almost 22 years ago now, would have all died of diabetes, right? Because all they ate was less than 8% fat, super low fat, and very high complex carbohydrates.
Now, are they on a lipid or glucose metabolism doing that? That's my question.
They're all burning glucose until they start exercising. At 30 minutes into exercise, they'll start burning lipid.
But they weren't eating any refined carbohydrates, it was a confounding.
Complex carbohydrate for sure.
Gotcha.
So healthy carbs.
The common theme between whatever's on the plate and your body getting better, whether it's vegetarian or meatitarian, is you're improving insulin resistance.
Exactly.
Yes.
Correct.
Insulin goes down. So I was dying for you to say
Yes.
that to the question earlier.
I get that part, yes.
Interesting. So I was always taught that you burn what you eat for energy. In fact, you can manipulate your body's energy burning
Right.
by changing what you eat. You eat carbs, you burn carbs. You eat fat without the carbs, you burn the fat. So actually, again, this is an emerging science. So we have anecdotes with, in my experience, in 10 people, 100. If you eat, it's called the RQ, which is the respiratory quotient, the amount of fat to burning and sugar burning, but there's also fat generation, which raises the RQ, so it's not a perfect measure. But this is a Steve Finney teaching. Basically, your RQ matches your food cue. So what you eat determines your body fuel mix. So I think total body energy-wise, if you're eating mostly fat, you're burning mostly fat in your body. I mean, how could it be otherwise? Right. I mean, as a
Because you're turning the fat into sugar.
well,
And so
now we play the game of is it the gun that killed the person, or was it a bullet? Or was
I
it
totally
the person who fired the gun? So you mean is the acetyl-CoA coming from a triglyceride or a fatty acid or
is
a
it coming from
glucose
fatty
molecule?
acid or glucose?
Oh, I got it. Why does it matter?
Exactly. That's my point. We're on the same page. It doesn't matter.
Ma'am, can I ask you from just a standpoint, what was the goal, what was the
My
factor?
primary question was that I'm trying to understand, because I'm Westman's train of thinking is where I was trained. I worked in a clinic where we did metabolic profiles. I could see RQs. I could see whether people were primarily, I could see the result of whether someone was a sugar burner or a fat burner, not just arresting metabolism. I found that data incredibly intriguing. I've also seen, we had athletes, we tested some athletes at rest for fat burners, some athletes at rest for sugar burners. They're both eating high carb, or their diet didn't seem to be that drastically different. However, I did follow them around, I wasn't sure. What I'm learning at this conference and from my experience is that having a more fat-based metabolism is healthy. It's good for the body, it's good for the brain, it's good for endurance, and we're learning even now that it's possibly power and strength can even be improved on a fat-based metabolism. What I'm hearing from, then when we went into the metabolism, I totally understand the Krebs cycle, and then saying that whether you consume the lipid or glucose is not determining whether you are a fat-based metabolism is where I was getting thrown off. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that just helps for my personal reference, but also as a coach, I always think about everyone else that's listening to the question, because, in males in particular, when they come, especially, they always want what do I need to do to build muscle or lose fat or whatever, naturally, because everyone's just always saying fat and carbs, or fat or carbs, or fat or carbs, and they forget about this middle portion. And males in particular, if we cut out one or the other, the middle one, we just throw it out. I mean, we will eat so much protein until it's, and it's stalling the process of what we're actually trying to accomplish, which is fat burning or, dependent. I was one that I always wondered why I could never take my body fat as low as a lot of the guys that I was competing with. And one thing that I never identified, I was always trying to manipulate these two, but one thing I never identified and was never changing was the protein, which is why I could never burn off those last, they were always 2 or 3% lower body fat than me. And I noticed it at all levels.
Fist pump. Protein is making you store fat.
Correct.
But the other thing,
Correct.
okay,
That's
so
why I said that. I just wanted to say that for everybody else.
one other follow-up to that, though, because you guys just talked about, the fatty acid turning, and I don't know, Dr. Westman, maybe I'm wrong on this, and I don't remember my nutrition biochem from school, but I thought only a tiny percentage of the fat molecule could be converted to glucose. That was my understanding.
Glycerol, yeah.
Glycerol, sorry.
Glycerol
Yeah, that's what I was just
glycerol
thinking.
backbone and the triglyceride, but 10% of a
Yes.
triglyceride molecule. So, I mean, my style is more the lumper than a splitter, right? Or if I can explain something 95% of the time, good enough for me. And we're talking about many people here who are in that 95% and many who are not. And so the other thought, though, is why not just the methods we have need to be better. So I bet in your lab you weren't really getting the true estimate of sugar and body fat and how much protein. I was always taught 20% of protein could be turned into glucose, and yet you said 80%.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's depending on how much protein you eat.
It depends on the protein. It depends on
so-
the
Well, and
resources.
it also
Yeah.
depends on the metabolic state of the body, because what I would see of people, catabolic people would come in, especially with eating disorders or people who are under eating, you would see them basically burning 40% protein. You could see that on their
as
metabolic
measured
profile. No, through the resting metabolic machine, measuring the actual RQ, but
Well,
that's a
and that-
catabolic person.
That has its limitations. So anyway, that gets into the advanced kind of testing. In terms of the ketogenic diet, I think we're in its infancy. So you're trying to get more precision than we have the ability to have at the moment. You know, we see that star, was that a planet? Wait, we need a better telescope.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have a question. I'd like to know what happens to glycerol that's been stripped from, maybe you got answered somewhere here, but, so you strip the glycerol backbone off the triglyceride, and what I have been taught and understand is that then that's what's getting recycled through gluconeogenesis. It's being converted to glucose. It doesn't take many steps to do it. But what would happen then if you're not? It sounds like, I don't know how to state my question. Is there any other pathway for glycerol in the body besides gluconeogenesis?
Yes, you're taxing my brain. That's why I have charts. That's why I have books.
Yeah. So I think in the end, we've proven with chronic disease that you can burn absolutely every ounce of fat out of the body. And I've seen, pancreatic cancer patients a couple years in that weigh 59 to 69 pounds, adults. And so they look like walking skeletons. And so they have, out of no fuel coming in the mouth, they have turned all of their muscle and all of their fat into fuel. And so I think the answer is unequivocally yes, you can turn all of your fat into a usable fuel source, and you can turn all of your muscle protein into
No,
glucose.
I was asking if there was any other pathway for glycerol other than getting converted to glucose.
Gluconeogenesis.
Yeah.
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah, glycerol sometimes is used as a proxy for lipolysis in the blood. It's a marker of how well you're accessing the fat just by measuring the glycerol. That's a good question. That's a Low Carb USA San Diego question. And,
I have lists of questions. I have lists of
So do
questions.
they.
So there's a gentleman here who's been trying to ask a question for a while. You wouldn't mind taking it?
Thank you. First, I'd like to know the spelling of the Asses that you spoke about.
ASEA. Let's see you.
Okay. And my second question, I hope is not too esoteric, but
can you speak up just a little?
it's well established in the literature that low carbohydrate diets, lower insulin levels, raise your serum hormone binding globulin. And so what relationship does that have to when you were talking about, Dr. Reeds, about all the hormones pressing each other's buttons, and then from an endocrinological perspective, we've seen this with patients who are on hormone replacement who go on to a very low carbohydrate diet, have lower insulin levels, and highly elevated levels of serum hormone binding globulin.
Yeah.
Have any of you experienced that, or what is your interpretation?
I'm not aware of any data in terms of SHGB, serum hormone binding globulin. Hormonally, I see great changes. So people come to me with PCOS, they haven't had a polycystic ovary syndrome, they haven't had a period in years. They start menstruating in 2 weeks. You have to tell people, be careful, you might get pregnant. Well, I haven't been pregnant, I haven't had, no, you need to start having contraception. And usually most of the time people are happy with that. I'll even get the referrals after they've gone through a fertility program at a major university, through all of the medication in vitro, and it doesn't work. They come, change the food, who's on, and things get better. So I usually see improvement in hormone function. I don't know about the measurement. Again, I think that's one of the things that needs to be done.
We've measured it, that's why I've asked.
And the SHBG starts to drop as the insulin drops.
No,
No, it rises.
goes
Oh,
up.
it goes up. Yeah.
Goes up.
4%.
Any change is accused of being abnormal, right? When this might actually be a normalization, right? So we're creating a new normal range of ketones. If you think nutritional ketosis is normal for you non-carb eaters, so it's not normal for a carb eater to have a ketone of 2 millimole, but it's the normal range. So there's a figure in the Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance, the Finney and Bullock book, of here's what the normal range of nutritional ketosis is. But if you're a carb eater, it's abnormal. So I could envision that there's going to be, for any measurement, there's going to, if there are enough people who don't eat carbs and it penetrates into the population, we need good normal ranges. Or the tail is going to move over as more and more people adopt that. Right now, I have to imagine in a clinical study, if they see someone with a ketone level of 2, they throw it out as an outlier. And I remember the food studies where you ask people what they eat. If they were eating 0 carbs, they threw it out as an outlier, because nobody does that, right? So it's going to take clinical research rather than epidemiology. In a clinical practice, if you had 50, 100 people, here's what I see, we could get that published. There are journals now with the advent of electronic publications, even in Medline. Here's a new normal range of people with not eating ketones, including SHBG. We don't know what this means. Help us out. And now you're not just asking us, you're asking the world who read the articles. That's the stage where we are. We're publishing what we see, getting it out there, having people comment on it. But I don't know what that means.
I don't either, but there are plenty of papers published on PubMed that validate what I just said.
Yeah.
What do you think it means? Or you don't know?
I don't know, that's why I asked the question.
I'll talk to that just briefly, but the SHBG is going to always be correlated with insulin sensitivity. And so as your total insulin level goes down, your SHBG and testosterone levels are going to go up as a male, your estrogen levels will go up as a female, as long as you've got good stimulation of the insulin intermittently. So it was mentioned if insulin goes very low, then estrogen will go low. Insulin goes up, estrogen goes up. And so the reality is there's no such thing as bad hormone. The only badness that comes from a hormone if it's not being regulated, right? And so it's the counter-regulatory state of a hormone where it's now just a stress response stimulation of production of insulin or estrogen or testosterone or whatever it is. Now they shift from growth factors into inflammatory compounds. They push a pro-inflammatory cascade. And this is why all that hormone replacement therapy we were doing with Premarin and everything else in the 1980s and 90s, we finally did the Women's Health Initiative and showed, oh my gosh, estrogen is supposed to be this really nice pro-growth regulatory hormone, increasing muscle mass, maintaining youthful skin, all of this stuff, and yet we found out we were causing breast cancer and heart disease because we were using the hormone in a completely different dose and dose response curve and everything else, giving it orally than it would have been secreted from the adrenals or from the ovaries.
Yeah, but what we've I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, but what we've discovered is, for example, in males in particular, that you have to increase their testosterone dose because they're no longer experiencing the benefits of testosterone replacement when the serum hormone binding globulin is going up.
Yeah.
So
And that's because you're exogenously replacing testosterone.
yes.
If the testosterone is being produced by the testes, then the HCBG is going to track with their biologic production. When you take an exogenous hormone, it's going to mismatch with binding globulin, and you're going to have mismatch. And so that's why you're having this back and forth. And so the best way for you to raise a man's testosterone is to lower their insulin. And giving exogenous testosterone through a patch, which is 24 hours a day delivering testosterone, or through a depot injection that has this huge long peak of testosterone, totally non-biologic approach to use of testosterone. And so testosterone is supposed to surge in the morning and then taper off just like cortisol and so many of your other regulatory hormones. All your catabolic, all your anabolic hormones have to be intermittent. If you put them on all the time, you actually get a catabolic breakdown stage.
I agree. And we use a slow gel release in the morning so that it gives that circadian rhythm of release. But what we found in patients who have come to us for testosterone replacement or in patients that have been on low carbohydrate diets, invariably, so that includes those that haven't had hormone replacement, we find that the serum hormone binding globulin. Now I know it's an esoteric test and not many people perform it, but we did because of what we saw was occurring with those patients. And I don't have an answer.
SHBG isn't that esoteric actually. If you order a biotestosterone from Quest or LabCorp, it'll give you the whole panel: total testosterone, SHBG, and free testosterone. And so you can order it just as a panel, so it's pretty easy to order. And I do recommend getting it because it really helps the men out because their total testosterone may be very low to start with, and so they say, I need testosterone. But the SHBG is super low because they have a lot of insulin. And so when their SHBG is very low, then whatever testosterone they're making, there's a high free testosterone in the bloodstream, even though their total is low. And so it's the free T that's going to really determine the biologics. And I think there's millions of males being put on exogenous testosterone right now that had normal free T levels right before they were put on testosterone. And when you put them on exogenous testosterone, you make them insulin resistant and their insulin goes up and it can be a vicious cycle. That's why your diet is really helping. I think, you know, the point here that we're starting to get to, and I love all of the let's get together and agree instead of disagree, is what if we called it, instead of a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet, what if we called it a low insulin diet?
Yes.
Now, what if we call it a low insulin diet? And if we call it a low insulin diet, now we realize that the ketone wasn't the thing that was making the person feel better. Ketone doesn't grow back brain. The brain doesn't even like burning ketones. It prefers glucose. What is helping the patient get healthier is the insulin levels are dropping. The reason I'm starting to believe this might be the case, and I don't know, I'm telling you right now, I have no idea if we should drop the belief that the ketone is making the person better. We know that the ketones in cancer and early disease cell populations can increase attrition. You can get the turnover and all of that from the damaged cells. But in a healthy organism, it's probably not the ketones that are making the longevity happen, it's the very low insulin. And the reason is because I'm one of the few people maybe up here that I'm not a ketone guy. But I use ketosis in my clinic, but most of my clinic is a healthy, slow carb clinic where we're doing, you know, moderate fat, and I'm way more high fat than Barnard and a lot of the other vegan clinics are. Esselstyn and those guys, they're all down like less than 5% fat. But I have to admit that they have 40 years of longitudinal data in the same patients that have survived under that diet to say they are on a very low insulin and have a lot of longevity. And so both diets are low insulin diets.
I have to add something there because this is, when I hear about the vegan studies, and I totally agree. I don't think that there's any one way to approach even something like cancer. I think that there's diet variation is legit. But when you're talking about like Dean Ornish's program or like the program you're discussing, it is a total lifestyle program. It is not just about the food that you're putting in your mouth. And a lot of the people that I'm working with are on the computers at 1 o'clock in the morning, stressing over their disease, you know, looking at things. You know, their stress levels are really high, their sleep is terrible, but that's not happening with the Ornish crew. And I think that that's a critical part. It's what, you know, it's a part that we are, that I think that we are failing people in, is not bringing up
100%.
more lifestyle.
100%.
And it's happening now. I mean, we are talking more about
Got a question
lifestyle.
over here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So my question, just one question. In all your intakes you've taken, either in terms of actual labs or history of sheath complaint, have you looked at any of the common polymorphisms, let's say methylation? I don't mean just FTHFR, but CBS and some others. Any correlation with that relative to ketosis? You know, we talked about schizophrenia, and so it happened to be that's also associated with that. Any heads up on that? Nada?
We don't have the ability to look at it at that detail.
Well, I was thinking if they came in that was part of the intake, oh, you have these positive, not quite sure it's relevant, but it's something in their life. They go through the program, they have, yeah, they lost weight, but these other weird things happen or didn't happen.
I'm sorry, what was the weird thing?
So if they had it in their history, so it might have been the auditory hallucinations. It might have been another patient with another variation of something that, you know, isn't that interesting? They had a correlation of a few semi-popular polymorphisms that also went along with the ketogenic diet that got to that kind of thing. You see, it's sort of a little more elaborate history or a little more elaborate not.
Yeah, that's wide open. No, I never go into that detail and don't measure those things. We're not a research center.
I can speak to that a little bit because, you know, I work with patients, I mean with clients, not patients. But some of the naturopathic doctors are looking, they're asking people to get the 23andMe because they want to look at methylation patterns. But the conventional docs are not the least bit interested in that information at this point.
Because they don't know what to do with it.
Well, Not only that, I think it's not part of what they've been taught in medical school. Would you agree, Eric, Dr. Westman?
Well, yeah, and 23andMe will tell you to eat a low-fat diet.
Yeah,
Lipid panels. The recommendations they use are going to be based on the expert opinion, but that's pretty cool to try to use something else and then correlate it. Never done that.
I think it'll be interesting, because it'd be a freebie, if you just simply had that as data, before and after, saying,
Yeah.
because you had such an interesting case.
I also want to make note of, you're also talking about hormones and suppressing natural hormones. And we're not talking about, for instance, like the body produces creatine naturally. And by supplementing exogenous creatine, there's a lot of studies out there that show it does not suppress natural creatine production, which is like Dr. Dom, a lot of his research shows how exogenous ketones would, if you're applying it to the same thought process or application as hormones like testosterone or human growth hormone, where it's suppressing your natural production, what you're finding, what Dr. Dom's finding is actually counter in that space. Because I hear a lot of that question, I got that question a lot out here, and I just want to make sure that I address that, and there's a lot of research in that space.
I agree, but I would say, I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I would just recognize that research is being done in the hyperfit. By and large, that research saying that exogenous ketones don't suppress endogenous.
It's actually Angela's doing it and not the super fit. Actually,
that would be very interesting
Yes.
data. So the reason is because our clinical experience, and I was talking to Dan Pompin, he had to leave earlier, so you can't tell us in person, but he had his little group of 25 chiropractors all put people on exogenous ketones for a prolonged period of time. It was 8 or 12 weeks where they were all day. And these were not super fit, these were not bodybuilders or anything else. And what they found is there was a significant portion of them that started gaining weight, not losing weight. There was a portion of the population that did lose
So
weight.
how many grams of beta hydroxybutyrate?
You'd have to
What was
answer
the
that.
source of beta hydroxybutyrate? That's one of the things where now it gets really.
Well, in some ways it doesn't matter because the population responded differently, is the point.
Right, because
So I
it's
don't
going
care
to
if
be a
it's a
different
good
utilization.
ketone or not, or a good source or not, the population responded differentially. And so for some of the population, the ketones suppressed fat metabolism and they started storing fat. For some of them, the ketone at the same dose, from the same manufacturer, was causing them to lose weight. And so, like you've pointed out many times, we are infantile in understanding the interplay. And when the ketones shut down, ketones from an endocrine standpoint, it's almost impossible to imagine a scenario where taking exogenous anything doesn't shut down a pathway that was making that thing. It has to happen in some circumstances. Now maybe if your dose is right and your body's revved up enough, the ketone's never enough to suppress endogenous production. And maybe taking the exogenous ketone is enough to make you more insulin sensitive so that you're better producing ketones. So it wouldn't surprise me if taking ketones exogenously can increase your ketones production endogenously. It won't surprise me at all if taking the same dose in another person will lower their ability. And so this is why we need to give our patients and ourselves a huge room for just, there's no right answer to this. You don't have to take exogenous ketones if it makes you heavier right now, but if we get your insulin low enough and get you a little more fit, and you take ketones 3 months from now, you might lose weight on it. And so that's why I really like what you've mentioned you do for yourself and Dan does for a lot of his patients, is cycle, cycle, cycle. And I'd love to just take that moment to step back away from the nutrients again. So now maybe we're starting to see that maybe ketogenic diet is super effective because it's a very low insulin diet. Vegan diet, very low fat, maybe is achieving a very similar result because it's a very low insulin diet. They're not going to go into ketosis, but they do have very low insulin. And we see both populations having better outcomes than the typical population that's eating a high insulin diet. And so it's not going to surprise me if in the end we find out we're all on the same team. Everybody's talking about the same thing, is stop eating processed shit and start eating real food. And you're going to get better, And so I think that that's the confounder of all of our science, is we're trying to say this diet's better than this diet. But in fact, both diets are so much better than the status quo that's driving disease that there's no right or wrong.
We've been having this discussion in the online community for over 5 years. We have talked about the no crap diet and the low insulin diet. That's come up many, many times, that we are on the same page. The problem is you've got leaders on the vegan side, well, it's just us, and people on the keto side, oh, it's just this. And I agree with you. I think if we all realize it's all about controlling that hormone, then I think we would further along the health community and people wouldn't be so confused. Part of the issue is people say, well, should I choose a vegan diet? Should I choose a keto diet? And we're like, give people the option
Yes.
of what works best for their lifestyle.
And think about cycling. Give them permission.
We
to
can
give up.
discuss that. I have some disagreement with that, but we'll see.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
So, we're coming from a couple of different places here. Both of them have profound impacts on people. Do you all agree that fasting has a place, whatever you decide to eat, that if you just shut down for a while and let your body heal and do some things, and then turn it back on, try a different diet, see how it makes you feel, but to just, is fasting a good thing?
No, it's crazy. Don't ever.
Sarcasm?
Yeah.
Yes, quite sarcasm. You need a sign.
What's that new book you're doing?
So, your body doesn't shut down when you don't eat.
Yeah.
I'll ask this, no, you didn't eat? No, well, how are you still alive? Well, you're burning your body fat. Yeah, oh, right, you mentioned that to me 10 times. And, so you're burning your body fat, so is it healthy to be burning body fat? Well, it looks like that's the emerging science, yeah. So I'm all for eating less. In fact, in the obesity medicine world, we're trying to just get socially acceptable ways to get people to eat less. And that even includes going to the surgeon and they make your stomach as big as an egg. I mean, that's crazy. That's wild. So yeah, I'm all for fasting.
I would say that along that line is it eat less or eat less frequently? And so I'm very much in the Dan Pompa category is you don't want to always calorie restrict because then you slow your metabolism down. The hypothalamus of the brain counts your total calories in to an accuracy of 8 calories a day. That's 2 peanuts. And so that's pretty phenomenal, but it does something more amazing is it counts how many carbs or how many calories you burn in the day. And it matches those to within 8 calories accuracy. And so if you are chronically calorie restricting, which is all of our diet industry, is chronically calorie restricting people, you'll find that they lose weight, and everybody knows the curve because you've experienced or all your patients here. They're obese, they're getting obese, and then they change their diet and they start to lose weight and then they plateau. And what's happened when they plateau is they went to a 1,200 calorie diet instead of a 2,000 calorie diet, and over the course of 6 weeks they simply adjust their metabolism to burn 1,200 calories instead of 2,000 calories. Now the woman goes back to an 1,800 calorie or 1,600 calorie diet because her diet is done, and she starts gaining weight because her body is now only burning 1,200 calories. And so then now she's like, well, shoot, I have to go on another diet. But now she goes back.
No, you don't. You don't count calories and your body does it automatically. You don't have to do that. That's one way to do it.
Oh no, I would totally agree with you. None of us should be counting calories.
So the metabolic response to lower the metabolic rate is a good one. You don't want to have a high metabolic rate. You want to live as long as you can. And this was Ron Rosedale in a lecture in Vail last year, Low Carb Vail. No, it's not. I don't think. I think the jury's out. So you need more metabolism, high metabolism. These are the runners and metabolism. Well, I'm not so sure. After you want to live as long as you can, not as fast as you can, you might not want the metabolism to be so high. But to shade it, the type of diet you choose will have a different effect on the metabolism. And that was only just in the last couple of years, a study out of Harvard. The reduction in metabolic rate you get with a high carb, low calorie diet was a greater reduction in the resting metabolic rate than on a low carb diet. They both lowered the metabolic rate. But so, I don't know, I'm seeing people who are 15, 20 years into a ketogenic diet, their metabolism's slow, they don't eat much, they're feeling great. I wonder what the 117-year-old lady in Italy had for a metabolic rate. I mean, our metabolism slows with aging, that's kind of a general phenomenon. Look, Dr. Bush, you have a tendency to say that if it's new and different, it must be bad. I'm just joking. You don't, but most doctors do. They'll say, oh, the metabolism is too slow, you got to get the metabolism up. No, not necessarily. And
So here's the caveat to that is there's got to be a threshold there, right? And so is a 4,000 calorie good thing over 2,000 calorie metabolism. I'd say there's no data on that. And it's not going to surprise me at all if we find that longevity is actually better in the lean, low metabolism person than the really muscular, high metabolism person.
And just to throw another wrench, the doctor tragically who recommended caloric restriction for longevity died. He didn't live forever. So we can do things in animal studies, we can do it, and so we may have our best guess.
Let me give you the dumb guy study.
Yeah, go
Let
ahead.
me give you the dumb guy study. The dumb guy study is this: after 10 years of being on a high carbohydrate versus a low carbohydrate, the number one reason, and let's get real, we all care about what we look like in that mirror, right? Here's what I will tell you. Number one, I am able to maintain my physique now, which before, through a high carbohydrate, in order for me to get where I am right now aesthetically, I would have to calorically restrict. Where I'm at right now with more of a ketogenic lifestyle, I can have much, much higher caloric intake, and literally, not only do I look as aesthetically pleasing, I also function mentally, cognitively,
If I do
and
this.
physically. I function so much better, right? So that's why
From a population standpoint, though, there's some concerns to that conclusion. So what you're doing is you're defining an aesthetic ideal that may have nothing to do with longevity. And so all of our
well, if I calorically restrict, I will decrease someone else's longevity.
that means you're hypotrophic and you're not self-love enough. If you,
No comment.
But I want to go back to his question about fasting, and we were talking about this whole idea of a low insulin diet. That's the ultimate low insulin diet. You know, if you want to cut your insulin, fasting will do that quicker than even a ketogenic diet.
Totally agree.
And so that would be the benefit of going on fast from time to time.
I think intermittent fasting is super powerful because what it does, getting back to that SHBG story, totally revs up a whole bunch of different hormone pathways. It shifts them from counter-regulatory back into regulatory. It upregulates receptors and binding proteins that will carry those hormones effectively in the body and increase your total reservoir of lots of beneficial hormones. There's 42 clock hormones that turn on at 4 a.m. and we've only named like 13 of them. In the endocrine world, we don't know what the hell we're talking about yet. There's over 420 hormones that we haven't even figured out the exact protein structure of yet. All we know is they're acting as hormones in the system somewhere. So to say that we understand anything about hormones is totally wrong. We're just scratching the surface. But let's back up for just a second and think about when you're not fasting. One thing that you guys were reflecting on really beautifully is this woman that you described who has a GBM, glioblastoma multiforme tumor, and now she's found a lifestyle where she no longer has to think she's ketogenic or trying to be ketogenic or trying to count anything, and she has found a lifestyle where she's very intuitive about what her body needs. And let's think for a minute about human behavior, and when we are busy, what happens to our food diversity on the plate? It narrows immediately, right? So when we're too busy, we start eating the same 3 or 4 foods over and over again. What does that do to your bacterial ecosystem? Narrows it. And so remember, we're talking about all these macronutrients, but those macronutrients are a tiny piece of what makes life happen. I think the majority of life comes from the micronutrients that aren't represented in the macronutrients at all, and are poorly represented in a lot of the high sources of protein or high sources of fat aren't terribly broad in their micronutrient delivery. And so we need to remember, no matter if you're plant-based, low insulin, or ketogenic / low carb, low insulin diet, you want to remember that health is going to also correlate with this lifestyle where suddenly you're intuitive about what your body needs, because it's not really your body that's calling for it, it's for the bacteria. A study was done just 2 years ago and has been repeated by 3 different universities, showing that if you take the bacteria out of the small intestine of an obese human and put them into a mouse, within a month the mouse becomes obese. The bacteria are programming the metabolism of the organism. And so when we go on a diet, it's probably not the calorie restriction that's making us successfully, sustainably lose weight. If we successfully and sustainably lose weight, it's because we reprogrammed a new microbiome that's programming us for a faster metabolism, or at least a more efficient metabolism, if high metabolism is the wrong term there. But it's fascinating to realize that your biome is programming your own metabolic lean versus fat body habitus. And it's something to think about for your patients who are doing any kind of diet and not succeeding. 85% of my clinic, probably like yours, is full of women. It is 85% women, 15% males. And a lot of them are in to try to lose weight. And what you'll find is that there will be a significant portion, no matter how strict they are with their ketogenic diet, they're not losing weight like they hope. And an interesting, bizarre new thought to put in your head is, what if they have a non-compliant husband in the household who refuses to change his diet, and therefore is reinforcing his microbiome to be an obese microbiome. And that woman keeps kissing and breathing the air that that guy is putting out. And this has worked so well in my clinic, is to have women who can't lose weight to divorce their husband and go find a skinny man. It works every time. No, I'm just kidding. What you do is you bring the husband in also and say, if you want your wife to successfully meet her goals, you need to make the diet change too, or you can never touch her, kiss her, have any sexual intercourse with her so that she can lose the weight appropriately. In fact, we need her in another side of the wing of that house so you don't breathe on her. And what's happened is that as you get the whole family involved, yes, the macronutrients can be screwed up and cause obesity because the insulin goes up. Yes, the microbiome can program you for obesity no matter what's happening with insulin. But most importantly, like you were saying, is that suddenly it becomes a lifestyle for the whole household.
Well, they both do it, and
So much
he
more
refers
successful.
to it as we.
We.
Bartender and we.
Yes. Big win there. Yeah.
So I have a very interesting.
Oh, wait, there's some
questions.
Somebody's got a microphone right here, brother.
Go ahead.
Basically, you just took the words out of my mouth. I found it interesting at a low-carb lifestyle conference that it was few and far between that micronutrients came into the conversation. It was all macronutrient, trying to balance that. And as a brain specialist and as a cancer specialist and probably someone who is looking at nutrients for recovery and all these other specialties, that those micronutrients are key. And in a low-carb lifestyle plan, I'm trying to wrap my brain around it because that you are obviously limiting things. And so where do you get all of those micronutrients on a regular basis to support the disease states or health goals that you're looking to optimize?
If I might address that for just a moment. So one of the things that might differentiate me from a lot of other people is that I don't believe in the power of plant foods. I haven't been convinced that plants have any particular magical powers. And it was in fact removing most plants from my diet that is responsible for me feeling better. That's just me, so I'm not saying that's true for everybody. But when I looked into the literature, what I discovered was that animal foods, particularly meat, poultry, fish, or whichever animal you choose, they're actually much better sources of most micronutrients than plant foods are. In many cases, they're the only source of key nutrients of some nutrients that are not available in plants. And furthermore, meat doesn't contain any anti-nutrients. So phytic acid, lectins, protease inhibitors, etc., that interfere not only with our ability to digest the nutrients in food, but they can actually irritate sensitive systems. Because the way plants defend themselves is through chemical weapons. They don't have fangs and claws, and they can't chase you or growl at you. So, and they've evolved over hundreds of millions of years to protect themselves, being stationary in a field, kind of like a sitting duck. So, if you're a very sensitive person, you may need to take a look at your plant food and take their. In any case, my point being is that I want it to be really clear that we don't make the assumption that plants are necessarily healthier than animal foods. That, to my knowledge, there's never been a study that compares a whole foods diet that contains animal protein with a whole foods diet that contains plant protein. That's a study that needs to be done. All of the vegan and vegetarian studies, some of which are excellent and have some very positive results, unfortunately they change far more than just whether or not the diet has meat in it or not. In almost every case, in fact in every case I'm aware of, they've removed almost all, if not all, of the refined carbohydrate. And that is in my opinion, the most powerful intervention that was made in those studies. So until we know what it would look like to take a group of people eating a whole foods plant-based diet and compare those people to a group of people eating a whole foods animal-based diet, we will never know what the true answer to that question is. But when you look at the botanical science and the biochemistry and the physiology, there's just no evidence that plant foods are necessarily superior to animal foods. In fact, there are quite a few instances in which that is not the case. So I just wanted to state that from the outer reaches of thought.
Well, and especially when you eat the whole animal.
Especially in the
Right,
children, exactly.
So you're getting all the micronutrients you need on a low carb diet if you're eating real food, optimally nose to tail, optimally sausages with liver. Liver is probably the most nutritious thing you can eat.
And the
So
most
micronutrients. okay?
And the most toxic.
Yeah,
depending
it's
on your
contaminated.
source. Right.
Well,
Grass-fed.
Yeah.
that, I mean, you're going to paint yourself into the corner of let's not eat anything. Like
No, I'm not.
after-
I'm just saying that liver is the filter that takes toxin out of everything. So if you have an animal that's grazing in an herbicide, pesticide environment, one of the highest places of concentration of herbicide, pesticide will be in the liver.
The liver doesn't absorb those toxins. The liver transforms those toxins and then they're eliminated by the body for the most part.
I thought the question had to do with micronutrients. That's a different question. And it's complicated, so you have to separate that out. There's no micronutrient deficiency if you're doing an adequately trained, low-carb, high-fat diet, even though you're not eating plants much. In fact, ask the wolf that eats no plants about their micronutrients. I mean, so you need to listen to this lecture by Steve Phinney, P-H-I-N-N-E-Y. We talked about how micronutrients were discovered right about 1910. And then this whole field developed about micronutrients, while the whole population started eating carbs. And the whole field of dietetics is based on micronutrients and measuring this, measuring that, measuring that. None of that was ever done before 1910. And the guy who came back from the Arctic not eating carbs was thought to be a quack. And so they locked him up for a year in New York City. He lived on an all-meat diet.
They didn't lock him up. They,
Okay, all right.
he volunteered.
I'm taking some liberty. And so here we go. We're out in the 6th lane. I'm in the one. I'm trying to take the exit. But no, there's no micronutrient deficiency. If my patient worries, I say take a multivitamin that has 120% of the RDA. Even RDAs aren't really based on great science. And then now add in, if you change to a fat metabolism, your micronutrient need will probably change. And vitamin C, we've heard all about, what does it do, nobody knows. You probably need a lot less when you don't eat carbs. So it becomes endlessly complicated, and I take some faith in the idea that humans lived for 490,000 years, or even more than that now if you didn't calculate micronutrients.
And we've lived suboptimal longevity that whole time.
Well, well, that gets into the can we do better?
Yeah.
So can you supplement? Can you add more? Well, prove it. Get some science. Don't just give some. Don't just give some.
Totally agree. We're infantile in knowing what to do.
Question back here.
We have to
So-
let this lady talk.
A couple of things there also, I'm thinking of a couple things, Zach, that I've heard you talk about.
Can you use
You're holding a
Oh, sorry.
microphone, please use it.
Oh, sorry. I tend to be a hand talker.
Just
A couple of things and I want to try to get them both answered with them. But there seems to be a controversy about the protein amount, and I know we're not talking about kind of counting, but it seems like there are studies that show even kind of moderate protein can be inflammatory, cause problems, and I'm interested in that, and that might speak to more of a plant-based diet, number one. And
Or a high-fat diet.
right,
They're
and
both
it
gonna be low
sounds
protein.
like Zach, you were saying there are a lot of studies that show that even 20 grams of protein or 40 grams of protein is just too much.
It's not too much necessarily, it's just there's going to be a significant portion that's still converted to carbohydrate at the liver. And it does depend on what the caloric restriction is, if they're restricted, not restricted, depends on which protein source it is, it depends on all these things.
Yeah, because some proteins are insulinogenic. So
Yeah.
what I find if somebody's having some issues there, I ask them to stop eating dairy proteins. And
Yes.
if sometimes it's
Totally.
even egg protein.
Gotcha.
Totally agree.
So here's the other part of the question for us non-vegans. If, is the other piece I was wanting clarification when I heard you kind of talking about that. Fish selection tends to be, I mean, do you think a meat over fish is better? Because I heard you say that a lot of the fish we're drawn to, the high omega-3 like salmon, is more problematic.
It's the same protein. And so salmon has the same protein as beef, L-carnitine. That's the vast majority of that amino acid structure of that fish.
Different fat.
What's that?
Different fat though.
Different fat,
Yeah.
same protein. And so, the recent data is very much under scrutiny right now because it's screwing up the high protein world. And so, the unique thing we have up here is I don't think anybody here is pushing a super high protein diet. We probably have different definitions of what a high protein threshold is, but we're pushing either a high fat diet or, and I'm not pushing any diet. I'm just, I really don't care if we do a high fat diet or a high complex carb diet. For me, I think I can achieve results in both directions as long as it's a low insulin diet.
Yes.
But, the interesting thing that we've never asked is what happens to the protein when it's digested by bacteria? We always assume that if we're eating L-carnitine, then it ends up as L-carnitine in our heart muscle. Most of our vascular tree is L-carnitine. And so, Stephen Sinatra, a cardiologist in Connecticut, all of his supplements, I've always had very high L-carnitine levels in them, with the assumption that the L-carnitine that is being consumed in your mouth is going to turn into the same L-carnitine that is constructing the vascular tree. Well, finally the question was asked, well, what happens to the L-carnitine when it goes into the microbiome? And in 2014 that was published that Saccharomyces, a very specific species within that family, digests L-carnitine. And when it processes L-carnitine, it's destroyed. There is no L-carnitine amino acid coming out the other side of that digested protein or amino acid. What comes out the other side is TAMO, this long chemical structure that's a known vascular toxin. And so in a single study, we had to ask ourselves suddenly, oh my gosh, all these years of people claiming that it was the saturated fat and cholesterol in the meat that was correlating with heart attacks that got us into the whole statin thing and got us all down the wrong road. Maybe it was actually the protein, not the cholesterol or not the saturated fat that was causing the vascular damage that led to the LDL deposition in the vascular tree that led to the heart attack. And so we literally haven't had the time or the resources as an entire scientific community to start to do the complex studies of saying, when you eat a mix of macronutrients and micronutrients, what does it look like on the ass end of all of those bacteria? And we don't know.
Well, and I want to throw something in there, a couple of things. One is that if you have a leaky blood-brain barrier, carnitine can upregulate fatty acid oxidation in the brain, and that may not be a very good thing to have happening there.
Yes.
The other thing is that there is a ketogenic amino acid. Lysine is only ketogenic. It can't be converted to glucose. And lysine combines with methionine, and some of my clients are like taking in 500 times the amount of methionine they need, and there are studies showing that methionine, there's associations with cancer and other diseases. So why not, if you think you need that carnitine, take lysine and the methionine that you already got in your body, let it do the work of making the carnitine. That's one of my 1,000 unanswered questions, but the lysine also has an antiviral effect, and I think it's I do it. I don't know if it's going to help me or hurt me, and I suggest it to the people that I work with because a lot of them are dealing with the herpes virus, and it has a known effect there with the herpes virus.
How do you take it? Where is it in?
I do powdered lysine, and I mix it with powdered calcium citrate, and I put a little heavy whipping cream in it. It tastes just like milk.
So what's the dose for lysine?
I'll talk to you about it.
Yeah.
So, back about 4 subjects ago, the microbiome. So we were doing some weight loss things with her patients and had them all eating what we would call a ketogenic diet, taking some exogenous ketone, doing everything we knew at the time, right? And there were 11 people. 2 of them, husband and wife, were so off the charts on their blood sugars and their ketones compared to us and all the other people that were doing this diet.
What do you mean by off the charts?
Super high ketones?
Well, not super high, but everybody else was like struggling. They're 0.3. I mean, we were in the 1 to 2 range. All of our patients were like barely getting any ketones showing blood. Blood sugar was 100. I mean, these were all obese people that were trying to help. But these 2 people, husband and wife, not related, obviously living together, both had almost identical numbers, and it was like 4.2, 4.8 blood sugars in the 70s, eating the same foods, yes. But it's interesting because we live together, eat the same foods almost every meal, and our numbers, they're not exactly the same, but they always go up and down together.
Exactly.
Theirs did the same thing. So
Totally.
I'm thinking this whole microbiome is like,
It's so critical to the piece.
we do eat the same macros, but
Did they have a hyperbaric oxygen tank in their house?
it was just, we couldn't figure out why we thought their
The
meters
first
were-
question I would ask is what pets did they have at home?
Really?
I think they had some pet that the other people didn't have, and it may have been a hedgehog. Hedgehogs have a very fascinating microbiome in their quills, and so I don't know if it's my hedgehog, but I would seriously ask because there's something in their environment that's giving them a huge metabolic advantage, making them very low insulin, despite, like you said, different genomes, so they should be much different. There's some bacteria or play there. And I would say if people are struggling with the herpes virus, it has nothing to do with a micronutrient deficiency or a protein deficiency. It has to do with a bacterial deficiency. Restore is one of the most profound ways to resolve, and Restore is not anything. It's not vitamin C. It has no active pathway that it fixes anything. All it is a communication network. But when you put that onto a raging shingles, herpes zoster on the skin, within hours, pain's going away. Within 2 days, all the blisters are gone, and they have no post-herpetic syndrome.
When you put Restore on?
When you put this Restore on the skin, why? Because that communication network of the bacteria is an antiviral. The bacteria are antivirals. The fungi are antibacterials. The bacteria are antifungals. There has to be this huge ecosystem balance between the big, quote-unquote, pathogen world out there. They're balancing each other. And so microbiome, and so if we see a virus in a situation or we see an abnormal metabolic function, we just only have to look like one little circle out to say what is their macro ecosystem. And what would be really exciting, since you guys have already identified that family, what we should do is do a house swap and take one of your families that's only got 0.3 and put them into that household for 2 weeks, and I'll bet you they're going to have high ketones, as long as they like hedgehogs.
We'll have to ask you about the
Early on in the beginning of this conference, a couple of speakers mentioned, they used the word refeeding, or I believe they did, and I thought there was going to be some explanation of that. I've never heard that phrase before. Or did I just misunderstand? Or did I just misunderstood?
So we explained it in my book, The Complete Guide to Fasting, so I'll explain it. So when you fast for a few days, and then you suddenly start eating again, you don't want to do that real fast. Anybody tried to eat a lot when you got off of a fast? It's not recommended. And you think you would be so ravenous, let's just say a 5-day fast, that you would be so ravenous that you would want to eat a whole lot. And there's been several studies, and maybe the doctors can cite the studies, but where they actually saw people suddenly die when they started refeeding. So that's where the term comes from, refeeding syndrome. But you can stave it off very easily. What we say to do is about an hour before you have your first meal after fasting, have a little something, like a small salad, a few macadamia nuts, something like that. And then go to your normal meal, and what you'll find is you'll eat about 1/3 of the normal size of the meal. But refeeding syndrome is a very real and present danger. We address this in episode 5 of Fasting Talk coming up the first week of February if you'll listen. But in a nutshell, that's what it is.
I have a quick question, and it's going back, following up on what she was talking about with the micronutrients and so forth. And so I'm also an RD. And I do understand you can get all your micronutrients from meat. I get that.
From
However,
microbiome. Microbiome is the only thing that delivers micronutrients.
Yeah.
right.
But
So-
it can do that from meat, you're correct.
Right, yes. So, and that goes to my question is kind of twofold, but what about the non-nutrient micronutrients? So I guess this non-nutrient, things like the polyphenols and the flavonoids and, quercetin, all those things that are, there's a broad variety of them from all different kinds of, fruits and vegetables, legumes and stuff. And so those have, I'm sure you all are aware of the properties that those have, and there's thousands of them. And then also how that variety of fruits and vegetables are the prebiotics for the microbiome. And I just wanted you guys to talk about that aspect of it.
Yeah, and that's a great question, if I might give it a try first. So I've actually looked at the antioxidants, or the powerful antioxidants in colorful fruits and vegetables. So a great example that I use in one of my presentations about general nutrition has to do with, has anybody in this room heard of Palm Wonderful? Which is this pomegranate juice in a really kind of curvy bottle, and I don't know how it costs $3 or $4 a bottle, and it's the commercial for it says it's loaded with powerful cancer-fighting, age-fighting antioxidants. And it is true. I mean, there are antioxidants in colorful fruits and vegetables, but the problem is that they only work as antioxidants in the laboratory in a test tube. When you actually put them in the body, almost none of them get absorbed into our bloodstream, and those that do are almost always transformed into something else before they are. So, for example, in the Palm Wonderful, one of the chief antioxidants in the Palm Wonderful, the name of which I'm forgetting now, only less than 0.1% of that powerful antioxidant is actually crossing into your bloodstream. And so what you're actually getting is 32 grams of sugar, and sugar is a very powerful pro-oxidant. So it's actually happening, you're buying and getting the opposite of what you were promised. So, and I think that that's a really common problem with the promise of fruits and vegetables, is that my belief anyway, from everything I've read, is the power of fruits and vegetables is not necessarily what's in them, but what's not in them. That, when you're eating whole foods, and you're not eating junk, you'll be healthier. But it's not because necessarily anything magical in those fruits and vegetables. There are nutrients in fruits and vegetables, by the way, don't get me wrong. I just think that in most cases, animal sources are a superior source. But there isn't, the antioxidant theory, as far as I can tell, it doesn't hold any water.
In cancer, it can be, actually, it can work against you. Because if you're undergoing a pro-oxidant therapy, and you take antioxidants, there are certain antioxidants that are contraindicated. So like green tea, they kick that out of certain chemo protocols. And I do think that there's some science behind certain of them. But I mean, just think of I guess it's polyphenols that are in caffeine. Now, caffeine's not a carbohydrate, it's not a fat. It's caffeine. So it's coffee, I should say, instead of caffeine. And green tea, you're getting polyphenols from green tea. So there are things other than fruits and vegetables that you can get some of these nutrients from.
But they're totally different types, and I guess that's what my question is, as opposed to doing just that one type of polyphenol from, the types of foods that are ketogenic, you're not getting the whole variety of them all.
Well, and I'm very supportive of people eating non-starchy vegetables if this is yeah. As a matter of fact, there are people that keep their carbs so low that there's no room for that. And I like to broaden that out a little bit because I don't see a glucose insulin response from adding a serving of broccoli, and so why not go for it? But there are some problematic. Dr. is right. There are some problematic ones. There's the nightshade family, and those can be a real problem for some people. And so if somebody's having issues, that's one of the first things I'm going to ask them to do is pull out the nightshades.
Could I just add to that as a naturopath? I mean, both are right in terms of plant-based diet and not, but if you're eating animal fats, the plants are really important to the animals you eat. And so
Yes.
there is a chain there. So we're
Yes.
talking about direct to our mouth, but if they didn't, in the pretend world of no pesticides, and they're eating what they ate, we'd get really delicious and very nutrient-rich meat.
Yes.
So that's sort of what we're choosing here. So it's not for us, it's for them. That we, but without that, we get poor quality food, and we have a lot of problems.
Reading tons of papers, nutrition papers, I wish, if there's one thing, keep fruits separate from vegetables.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's always fruits and vegetables.
Metabolically, they're very different. Content, they're very different. You know, and you might think, where are you getting your vitamin C if you don't have orange juice from the state? Actually, you might be able to do better by adding all of these things. There's no human requirement for any certain food. It's the nutrient that the food is composed of. So whether it's green or yellow or brown or black, what you want to know is that you're getting sufficient building blocks for your body and energy and the minerals and vitamins. So we get a lot of marketing by people who want you to buy their products, and we learn our nutrition from companies that want us to buy their products. And the psychology of subtraction was something I learned from this meeting, that it's very difficult to take things away from people. And that's part of it. My patients who haven't had fruit for decades, they're doing fine. I mean, you know, there's no absolute requirement. In fact, before Johnny Appleseed took apples around the U.S., there weren't many. And if you read Michael Pollan's books on how, or Wheat Belly, on how the food has changed, we're not eating anything similar, but we could do better. We could add in polyphenols, resveratrol, and whatever, you know. And next time, let's have a talk on wine.
Yeah, wine's an incredible ferment, but one of the things that we keep saying is, you know, it's not just protein. There's so many different types of protein that act so much differently. I say the same thing for fruit. And apple is one of the most genetically modified compounds on Earth, right? The apples we have on the grocery store shelf never existed in human history until we kept breeding them into these high fructose, low fiber machines that have no resemblance to the original. Same with the potato. The russet potato that accounts for 95% of the potato consumption in this country has no resemblance to the over 400 types of potatoes that grow in Peru where the potato began. So I totally agree that when you say, you know, you don't need the vitamin C from the orange, but you might get it from bitter melon or one of these ancient, you know, fruits that are out there, or from broccoli, you know. And so there's just, it's worth noting that even today's cow never happened without breeding, right? We bred our cows to be 1,500-pound hamburger producers, right? That doesn't happen naturally. And so we have to come to terms with, I don't care if it's a grass-fed cow or not, it's an unusual macronutrient source that didn't exist 1,000 years ago. So as we start talking about real food, it'd be really cool if we keep progressing to the point where we start to bring back heirloom breeds of cattle and heirloom breeds of apples, where we're eating, you know, species variations and nutrient variations that really self-develop rather than human engineered.
By the way, the sugar content in that Palm Wonderful is cancer-fighting 38 grams, which is over 9 teaspoons of sugar.
So we've been talking about micronutrients, and I had a health condition, and I figured out a lot of stuff back in March of last year by studying old medical textbooks, going back from before 1960. So this is one thing I want to point out. Vitamin E was discovered in 1921 by a team. They all did feeding studies prior to World War II. So they'd feed animals foods minus certain parts of the food, and then they would try to get down to what vitamin was missing that caused that deformity or that disease. So and they started with, of course, they found vitamin A and B and C. They just went by the alphabet. So vitamin E was discovered in 1921, and it's so powerful for preventing sterility and bone deformities and stillbirths. Then in 1936, the AMA came by, and at this time there were supplement companies that were making whole food supplements, and they were doing well. Henry Harrower was a guy that, the father of endocrinology, he started his supplement company back then, and Roy Lee started Stand Process back then. But in 1936, the AMA, which at that time was the fourth arm of the government because it was so powerful, said vitamin E was tocopherol and it was an antioxidant. So they kind of like washed away all that fantastic research from before, and now every single person, every researcher, every consumer of vitamin E thinks it's tocopherol or tocotrienol, but it's not. It's this big, huge, incredible, dynamic complex. It should be a hormone. It's like way more than what we think it is.
And what's your question?
I don't have a question. I'm just telling you these
We need to
comments.
get people to have questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just couldn't hold my tongue, so sorry.
Sorry, it's a moderator. I can't help myself.
That's a good point.
Good stuff. That's good.
I'll just give you one of my last thoughts, and that is that everyone needs to be really careful leaving here today, because if you get hit by a bus, none of this actually
Drop the mic, brother.
I've already asked a question.
So anyone else got a question?
Can you speak louder? You need the
Yeah, is there a good way to wash vegetables? I'm still gonna eat them, so, wash them in a certain way, like soak them for a certain amount of time, or add Lugol solution or something to get glyphosate off? I mean, I bought Restore and I can't wait to use it with my family, but I still wanna like wash my organic vegetables, maybe get the glyphosate off.
Right, unfortunately, it's a water-soluble toxin, like we mentioned the other day, which means it's pulled into the water of the actual vegetable. And so if you have a conventionally grown cucumber, very little of the total glyphosate on that thing is on the skin. It's been sucked up through the roots, because most of that glyphosate is not going to end up on the surface of the cucumber, it's going to end up in the soil. And the water being sucked out of the soil for the plant to make that watery cucumber or watermelon or whatever it is, or apple, it's going to be in the water of the fruit that the glyphosate is there. And so, water is certainly the best detergent or that we have on the planet. It works better than soap or anything else for breaking down
What
whatever
about
it is.
vinegar? People sometimes will spray their produce
Sure,
with vinegar.
you can spray it, but I would do a mix of water and vinegar, because it's actually the alkalinity that's happening when the vinegar interacts with water, and I think it's actually the water that's really scrubbing it more than a pure vinegar.
They usually recommend like a half and half.
Half and half, exactly. So half vinegar, half fat. You'll get whatever's off on the surface, but none of that's going to touch what's inside of it. And so oftentimes when I'm preparing a salad at home, even if it's organically grown kale, I'll just sprinkle some bacterial metabolite on top of it, understanding that I need to prep that gut for the exposure that it's going to have.
Or grow your own food.
Yeah.
Or just go easy on the potato. That's kind of a joke.
It's too late, baby.
So it'd be nice to say just grow your own food, which is true, but when 75% of the rainfall and air that we breathe is contaminated with this chemical now, we just can't get away from it completely, and so we just have to come to terms with that, and so we need to respect the microbiome, because the microbiome, even apart from Restore, it doesn't matter. If you go get a rich microbiome by living all over the world and kissing everybody you find, you're going to be resistant to this toxic environment. Or dead. No.
Hi, I have a question. If we're reducing fruits and vegetables, I'm new to this, so if we're reducing fruits and vegetables and we're reducing fiber, and then we're fasting, and then our metabolism going slower, is anybody experiencing any constipation, or is there anything that, if that happens, how do we manage that?
A lot of people, that's one of the early symptoms that I like to be proactive about. And flaxseed, ground flaxseed, or chia seed are two things that can provide fiber. Some people will supplement with like psyllium seed husk to get the fiber. And I think that this is just a thought that people who don't eat, who just eat meat and fat, are not getting their fiber, but they're still not developing. I mean, the Inuit didn't develop colon cancer because they didn't get fiber. So I think there's probably less of a requirement in it in some ways. Also, I think there's a danger in too much fiber and scrubbing out some of that mucosal lining in the intestine, and also absorbing too much fat. So you're not getting the fat that you need if you're trying for a high-fat diet. So
in general, this is not a problem for most people?
I think you can get avocado has a lot of fiber in it, it's a high fiber food. Flaxseed, chia seed, there's ways to do it.
And just water.
And just water,
Yeah,
yeah,
just
that's
drink a lot of
good
water.
point.
You won't not go.
So in a obesity medicine clinic, weight loss clinic, using a low carb, high fat diet, which is what I do, about a third of people will notice they have constipation, as defined by hard stools or hard pass stools, not going to the bathroom less often. There's a big confusion there. Just about everyone goes to the bathroom less often when you're not eating as much and you're more efficient with what you eat. And you change the microbiome. No question, low carb diet changes the microbiome. And the remedy we like to use is 1 teaspoon of milk of magnesia at bedtime for 1 week. It's a little trick that's learned from very low calorie diet programs, other programs. Turns out fiber is kind of this non-nutritive thing that is really in search of something beneficial. I mean, the studies really haven't shown that you're low in fiber, you get any disease. And that had to do with giving fiber back in experimental trials. What was found in epidemiology wasn't found in experimental trials. We really need that experimental.
I think the fiber helps with the regularity. That makes people feel better.
Regularity.
And it beats the gut health.
It definitely changes the microbiome.
Yeah.
The fiber definitely has an effect on the microbiome.
Yeah, so, but not to worry about major cancers, things like that, if you're going to the bathroom less often. And hydration, drinking plenty of fluids, and then if you don't have high blood pressure, or you don't have heart failure, having bouillon, adding extra salt supplementation. We violate several general principles you learn. You can eat fat, you can have salt. In fact, we push salt, and it's the hydration, but to hold on to the water, you need salt. Anyway, you'll probably have to hear that several times, or just take the milk and mag for a week.
Thank you. And about that salt, people, well, from what I've read, we're losing sodium and potassium. Do we need to supplement potassium, and if yes, how?
It's called an avocado. There's twice as much potassium in an avocado as there is a banana. And so eat an avocado a day and it'll keep the doctor away.
I wanted to just add to the excellent answers about constipation already. Sad to say, I have too much experience with this. But ketosis and constipation, there's a very short article on my website about this if you're curious. In my opinion, in many cases of constipation, except when you're first adjusting to a ketogenic diet, which may have to do with fluid and electrolyte imbalances, and just adjusting to your diet. In many cases, it's because people are starting to eat a lot more of a new food that they normally weren't eating much of. And there are certain foods which are much more difficult to digest, just naturally harder to digest, such as nuts and cheese, and even cruciferous vegetables. So some people, the heavy cream, dairy. So in some cases, people have switched the types of foods they're eating so much when they go onto a keto diet that they may have added something in that's really hard for them to digest. And so one thing, and just as a troubleshooting point, if the other recommendations haven't worked, you might want to take a look at the actual components of your diet and try taking one of those things out and seeing if that works. I know it's worked for a lot of people, just as a food sensitivity suggestion. Yeah?
I just wanted to ask if you have any thoughts on autoimmune disease and the low-carb ketone type diet, like from Hashimoto's to lupus and things like that. Do you see any?
Yeah, boy, I really like Terry Wall's book, The Wall's Protocol. I think she nails it on so many points. And again, it's a whole lifestyle thing. It's not just a diet. And she puts the diet in 3 levels, and the most rigorous one that she calls the Wall's Paleo Plus is actually a ketogenic diet with about 3 cups of cruciferous vegetables a day and some other, like salads, lettuce, and I think that's a really good starting point for people with autoimmune issues.
We could go. Getting back to Steve Finney, in our world, when Finney says, everyone listens like when E.F. Hutton says.
Everybody remembers that reference, dude.
All right. Finney says, we all have inflammation. It's called constitutive inflammation. We need it, otherwise we will die. For you who are trying to lower inflammation, you want to lower it down to 0, don't. Okay? We need some inflammation. That's called constitutive inflammation.
Or acute inflammation, yeah.
So acute inflammation would be the acute inflammation would be some injury, but you have some background level. So with autoimmune, with irritable, inflammatory bowel diseases, I think of it, or even with any kind of inflammatory process, if you lower the food that raises inflammation, you're lowering this level, you get below a threshold of a symptom generation or disease generation. And so I've seen improvements, not total resolution, of those autoimmune diseases on a low-carb, high-fat diet, a low-carb ketogenic diet, same thing, in my practice, but very, very few publications, and it's that really, I mean, Hashimoto's, the general rule is go low-carb and no dairy, and there's some other restrictions. If you read a couple, get some books that are out there for Hashimoto's and low-carb.
Yeah, so from my perspective, it is all about leaky gut and less about the macronutrients or food sources. And so, getting the chemical out of the diet is obviously huge. So as organic as you can get with the food chain is probably as, if not more important than which macronutrient diet you go to if you're autoimmune. And the second piece of that really has to do with the longevity of the B cell. And so the B cell lasts 20 years. So once activated, it's making an antibody to the thyroid, TPO antibody. It's going to stay there in the GALT, in the gastrointestinal associated lymphatic tissue for 20 years. And so any stimulation to it, any outside antigen that stimulates the production of that antibody, it can trigger that at any time. And so it really is about the permeability or leak of that gut. And if you can close the gate, then no matter what healthy foods you feed them from there on out, the antibodies are going to drop, with the opportunity to turn right back on as soon as you remove it. So we've done trials with the bacterial metabolites where you put Hashimoto's patients on it for 2 years, and what you see is that there's almost no drop in antibody production in the first 3 to 6 months. And then suddenly around 6 months to 9 months, there starts to be a real significant drop, and around 18 months we see real naders. And so we'll get people from TPO antibodies of 300, 500, down to TPO antibodies that are still abnormal, less than 20 being ideal, and they're still in the 40 to 60 range, but now they've reduced significantly their exogenous thyroid hormone. Their thyroid's starting to produce more hormone, and their antibody levels are at a nadir. And then if we withdraw the bacterial metabolites, within 3 to 6 months, the antibody level's going back up again. And that's with no change in diet. And so they stay on a plant-based, high-fat, plant-based diet. And so I think we do pretty much the same diet at this point. It's kind of like a ketogenic vegan diet.
Yeah.
It's kind of what we're pushing. And so you're pushing a pretty high-fat, plant-based diet, lots of slow carbs, lots of healthy carbs in the mix. And what I find is that it's got more to do with how much bacteria are really supporting that matrix than the macronutrients. And if you lose that bacterial support, no matter if they keep the diet the same or not, and they're still doing a non-autoimmune or autoimmune diet, their antibodies will go right back up. As soon as the leaky gut happens, the antibody goes back up.
So the restore is like a panacea for the leaky gut.
It's a panacea for the leaky gut, yeah.
Okay. So we have to shut down here at 5 o'clock, so we got a few more minutes. I think it's appropriate that our most prolific question asker gets to ask the last question. Okay, so.
I was just interested in other ways of, because we're talking about mitochondrial health and density, and interested in other ways of addressing that. And I was curious, I've been reading about ASEA in terms of something that does that, and Zach, you had mentioned that. I'm curious if ASEA, this is one part of the question, if ASEA is something that would supplement what we're doing, if it would be helpful in terms of redox?
It's just one of the tools out there. But I would say before you ever reach for ASEA, you need to practice getting into a ketogenic diet where you're starting to really increase mitochondrial proliferation by forcing that shift to happen. And so I'd rather see somebody really doing 4-minute exercises 3 times a day, which I know is going to increase mitochondrial density, and doing intermittent at least or permanent. If somebody decides I want to be on a ketogenic diet, I would never argue with that. That's fine. I think what they'll find is the amount of ketones in the urine will go up and down over time, and they'll never, stay in a super deep state. with the exception of people who've been doing it for 20 or 25 years. Now, you get that far out in a deep, you might be able to stay in a deep ketogenic diet all the time. Because again, you're training your body to be in that environment. But nonetheless, that would be my take, is don't reach for a SIA to increase your mitochondria from a supplement standpoint. Take on a lifestyle where you're driving it. And that's where the trials were very successful. Remember the trials that showed all this remarkable reversal to neonatal metabolism were done in athletes. It wasn't done in type 2 diabetics who were insulin resistant and obese and everything else. They would not have had those results. And so never do I tell somebody, just start to see it, you got your mitochondria, your metabolism all good, you're good to go. It's a tool and it's a resource, but it's never replaced as a lifestyle.
Gotcha. And the other thing I was thinking about, I think Mercola talks about it, is kind of structuring water and being insulin seven.
That's such a big other topic, I don't think we should get into that. That would take us a week to talk about water structure.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Joel. Thank you so much for your time. You stood here for about 2 hours. It's amazing. Thank you very much.
We'd like to
But
stand.
I'm sorry, but I think that was about the most amazing panel discussion I've ever seen. It was incredibly valuable.
Thanks for giving us this amount of time. He promised me that we would have, a prolonged Q&A session, and he delivered.
Okay, so that's the end of it. As soon as I can get a quick commitment from a hotel or a hotel for a date for a thing, I'll put it out, and you guys can have about a week to sign up. And I'll send you all the PowerPoints as well. Okay, bye.
Thank you.